You know what's strange? Someone walks past you with rings stacked on every finger, 6, 7, 1 on nearly every knuckle, and your brain files it under one word almost instantly. Confidence. Loud. Look at me. It's the fastest read there is. It's also almost always wrong. Picture this. You're at a coffee shop and the barista handing you your order has rings on nearly every finger. A thin silver band on the thumb, something engraved on the index, a cluster of small stones on the middle finger. Your brain reaches for that same story again, chaotic, trying too hard. But watch what happens if you actually ask that person about any one of those rings. The story changes instantly. This one was my grandmother's, this one I bought after I left a job that was making me miserable. This one doesn't mean anything, I just like the shape. Suddenly, it's not a display. It's a timeline. It's a hand wearing a small, quiet archive of a life. That gap between what we assume and what's actually happening is the whole story here. And it points to something psychologists call the extended self. It's a concept that traces back to consumer psychology research from the 1980s, and the core idea is simple. We don't experience our identity as something that lives only inside our skin. We extend it outward into objects, your childhood home, your car, your handwriting. And for a specific kind of person, jewelry becomes one of the primary places that identity gets stored. This isn't decoration in the way a nice tie is decoration, a tie you put on to meet an occasion. A stacked collection of rings, built up one at a time over years, functions more like a physical diary. Each ring gets added at a specific moment for a specific reason, and then it stays. It becomes load-bearing. It becomes part of how a person literally recognizes their own hand in the mirror. And once you see rings this way, the whole picture of who wears a lot of them starts to look completely different than you assumed.
Because if it were really about drawing attention, you'd expect these people to explain themselves the way status symbols usually get explained. A watch collector will tell you the brand, the movement, the resale value. But ask someone with 8 rings why they wear them, and the answers rarely sound like status, they sound like memory. Let's go back further, because this pattern doesn't start in adulthood. Developmental psychologists have long pointed to something called transitional objects, a term coined by pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. In early childhood, a child attaches enormous emotional weight to a specific blanket or stuffed animal, not because the object is special in itself, but because it's stable in a way the rest of the world isn't. It travels with them. It stays the same when everything else changes. Most people grow out of needing a literal blanket, but the underlying mechanism, using a physical object as an anchor for identity and continuity, doesn't disappear. It just gets sophisticated, it gets smaller, it fits on a finger. A study published in the Journal of Consumer Psychology found that adults who report a strong sense of nostalgia are significantly more likely to keep and display sentimental objects rather than replace them, even when the objects have no practical or financial value. Rings are almost perfectly designed for this. They're small enough to wear constantly, permanent enough to survive years, and personal enough that nobody else needs to understand the meaning for it to matter. There's also a cultural layer underneath this. In households where big emotional milestones aren't talked about directly, where grief, transition, or achievement pass by without much conversation, an object can quietly absorb what words don't always express cleanly. A ring bought after a divorce, a ring inherited after a death, a ring picked up on a solo trip taken specifically to prove something to yourself. Nobody has to say any of that out loud. The ring just sits there, doing the remembering for you. So the pattern that starts to form isn't a person performing confidence. It's a person who learned early, often without realizing it, that objects can hold what feelings can't always express cleanly. And once that habit takes root, it doesn't stay confined to childhood. It follows a person straight into their adult relationships, their sense of self at work, and the way they present themselves to total strangers.
This is where the paradox shows up. The people who wear the most rings
are often the ones who talk about themselves the least. You'd expect someone covered in visible personal symbols to be an open book. Ask them anything, they'll tell you a story. But in practice, a lot of heavy ring wearers are quietly private people. They'd rather let the object speak than explain themselves out loud. It's self-expression that doesn't require conversation. You can carry your whole emotional history on your hand and never once have to justify it to anyone who asks. That paradox plays out everywhere. At work, someone with a handful of rings might come across as unconventional, maybe even a little unbothered by professional norms. But talk to them and you often find someone who's actually quite guarded, using the rings as a controlled, low-risk form of self-disclosure. They get to be seen without being known. A stranger notices the rings and forms an impression. The wearer never has to hand over the actual story unless they choose to. In relationships, it shows up differently. Partners of people who collect rings sometimes describe a specific kind of intimacy ritual, getting told the story behind one ring at a time, almost like being let into a room a little further with each visit. Researchers who study material possessions and attachment have noted that objects tied to specific memories can function as a kind of relational shorthand. Instead of retelling a hard chapter of your life in full, you can just say, "This ring is from then," and let the listener fill in as much or as little as they want to ask about. And this is where self-image gets interesting. For a lot of these wearers, the rings aren't really aimed outward at all, even though everyone assumes they are. They're aimed inward, a private form of self-continuity. Touching or turning a ring, a habit a lot of stacked ring wearers report doing almost unconsciously, has a mild grounding effect, similar to other repetitive, tactile, self-soothing behaviors psychologists have documented in stress research. It's not about being watched, it's about staying anchored to yourself in rooms that don't always feel steady. So the loud "look at me" assumption gets it backwards on almost every level. The rings aren't a performance for other people, they're a private language the wearer built for themselves, one piece at a time, that just happens to be visible.
Which brings us back to that hand at the coffee counter, the one you glanced at, made a quick judgment about and moved on from in about 2 seconds. What you actually saw wasn't a bid for attention, it was a small, wearable museum. A thumb ring from a hard year, a thin band from someone who isn't here anymore, a cheap little stone bought on a solo trip that ended up meaning more than anything expensive ever could. None of it was performed for you, you just happened to be standing close enough to see it. And maybe that's the real reason this pattern goes so unnoticed. We're trained to read big, obvious signals, the car, the watch, the outfit, as messages meant for an audience. Rings slip past that filter because they're small, because they're worn every single day until they stop registering as a choice at all, and because the story behind each one is almost never offered up front. You have to actually ask. Most people never do. So the next time you notice someone with a handful of rings, resist the urge to file it under confidence or vanity. What you're actually looking at is a person who found a quiet way to carry their own history with them, one small, permanent piece at a time. Not loud, not for you, just theirs. If this hit home for you, please subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button to become a channel member.